All right, guys, thank you so much for coming back. I know this is it's kind of a late evening here, and they actually told me I need to do a song and dance to get everyone, make sure that you're up for this. But we have a very exciting panel this evening. So I'm very happy that you all came here. My name is Jason Evans. I work at the University of Georgia. I work in the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. So with that job, I get the opportunity to work with policymakers and looking at energy policy, looking at water policy, all sorts of different things. And so it's just really a fantastic opportunity to be here this evening, to have this wonderful panel here, to really, with this discussion, we really wanted to have what I'm calling I guess like a lessons learned. If we go back to 2005, we've got there was a whole change in energy policy. It was called this is called the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And it's really what kind of set off the modern era that we have now of all of the research that we've been hearing about, the wonderful research that has to do with all sorts of things like biofuels, bioenergy, renewables, excuse me. And so with all of that there's with policy, there's always good, there's the bad, and then there's the ugly. And so what we really wanted to do is we have these folks here that have actually been in the trenches, that have actually been working in the energy field, have been working with partnerships. We've just heard a lot about partnerships with government and industry, with universities. And this is a complicated thing, partnerships, and how this works. And so with all that said, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it at the panel here to go through their experiences and to really just detail what they've learned, and then to kind of really get into a lively discussion. You can see here they have seats. There's no formal presentations for this one here, and we want this to be lively. And so we're going to start off with each of the speakers and have 6 to 8 minutes to just introduce their lessons learned, their experiences. And then from there, I'm going to have questions myself to prompt them with. They can have questions that they can ask each other. And then we're also going to have the audience. If you have questions, raise your hand. If we have a lull, then we'll go to you guys. And so this is really going to be, we want you, because we know it's late, we want you to be lively. We want this to be fun. And we want to learn some things from this. So I'm going to start off here with Paul Gilna from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So Paul, why don't you start here with 6 to 8 minutes? Sure.
So let me introduce myself first. I'm the director of the Department of Energy funded Bioenergy Science Center, or BESC. This is one of 3 basic research centers focused on bioenergy, and in particular focused on utilizing and harnessing the work of basic research to render more cost-effective our ability as a country to produce biofuels from largely cellulosic sources. And the sort of lessons learned that I wanted to share here is this is a project that was begun by the US Department of Energy now about 5, maybe going on 6 years. It's funded at a level of $25 million a year. It's been going on now for 5 years, and we're very grateful that we've amassed enough credible work that we were able to garner a renewal for another 10 years. Excuse me, 5, that's wishful thinking. What I wanted to talk about was describe the center a little bit, but also more to the point, use it as a sort of case example or a case study on what it takes to truly pull together a high-functioning partnership amongst a wide variety of institutions, which, as I have come to understand it, is one of the themes behind this particular conference. So BESC, in particular, is a consortium of the order of 18 different partner institutions. It's headquartered out of Oak Ridge National Lab. And in addition to Oak Ridge, we have established partnerships with a number of universities, notably University of Georgia and Georgia Tech in this area, but also universities on the East Coast, such as Dartmouth, universities on the West Coast, such as University of California, Riverside, or UCLA, as well as another national lab, the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, as well as a number of not-for-profit research foundations, such as the Noble Foundation based in Oklahoma. And finally, again, as part of this consortium of partners, we also reached out and drew in fairly close to the construction of this partnership a number of industry partners. So I can mention partners such as DuPont, Arborgen, Mascoma, Ceres. All of these are partners who, in a sense, live downstream or potentially downstream of the kinds of discoveries that we would hope to engender over the life of the project. And the primary purpose in establishing a partnership was both to accelerate the possibility of any of our discoveries or technology developments being employed, but also to operate in true partnership, in true intellectual partnership, not simply to sort of have someone there to hand off and take over developments that would happen. So there you have a partnership. As I said, 18 to 19 different institutions. We've actually added some as we've gone along. We've actually dropped some as we've gone along, which also starts to tell you that we have a very vibrant and flexible management structure that really takes into account where the science is going, as well as how any of the partners are performing, and allows us to be nimble and agile and be able to, if you like, flex the organizational structure. So what does it take to pull together a group of leaders in their science? We're all focused largely on basic science. And our consortium is drawn together from leaders in plant biology, in microbial biology, in biochemistry, in computational biology, and systems biology. And it has taken of the order of that first 5 years to really develop a true sense of not only partnership, but I would say collaborative spirit and collaborative value system for working together in that form of partnership, to the point where we might well have started out with what I might describe with respect PI think or principal investigator think, but we've moved now very concertedly to a project level think, where folks essentially make decisions together based on the fate and the rationale and the mission of the project as a whole. What it's taken, it's been a long path to do that. It's not something that simply happens overnight because you gave out a press release to announce a new consortium that had been funded by your favorite funding agency. This requires a remarkable level of commitment on the part of the participants and as well on the part of the institutions. The institutions, in our case, have been remarkably supportive. This kind of project, which is a very high visibility, very high probability of making a difference in this entire enterprise, has become something that is important, is an important cornerstone, an important jewel, if you like, in the makeup of each of the partner institutions. And so we see support essentially all the way up the command chain at these institutions. But more than that, what has been needed over, what has been developed and built up over this past few years is a remarkable level of trust. Trust amongst the different partners. Everybody has come from, and still is, an individual performer. Small team, small group, maybe large group in a university. And for all of those partners to really stretch to the point where they could place a level of trust in their colleagues and in their partners, this time from different institutions, some who might have even been competitors in a highly competed field to begin with. That has been an important underpinning and cornerstone. And it's not something to be underestimated in terms of the time and the effort and commitment to try and build something like that. This is not something that gets managed with a half-hour teleconference every 2 weeks of all of the principals coming together to find out what's going on. This is when you get on the phone, you get on the plane, and you move around. So the first message is commitment, and I think engagement and building of trust. It's essentially the task of leading leaders. But let me tell you what the payoff is. The payoff, if it works right, if you develop a high-performing team, is the net quality of your overall product starts to skyrocket. Because people within the consortium realize that they can reach out to different corners, different components, easily and sometimes seamlessly, and get additional work, additional analyses, additional science that adds to any of their particular individual results, and thereby building a broader product. The other amazing, I think, product of this is, in fact, the student body, the faculty body that we've built up, and the level of, even though we didn't set out to do this, the level of training that comes from this, training in the skills needed to operate in a team and collaborative environment. It's not something one normally sees in classroom or, for that matter, in many labs, but there has been a very natural development here of just what it means to work and collaborate and be productive in a very high-performing and widely distributed teaming environment, where your team member may be in a different college, in a different institution, in a different state. Again, that's a remarkable skill set to be able to endow in one's faculty or in one's students. And I think it's creating a different caliber of student and, for that matter, researcher as we move forward into what is likely to be more and more projects of this ilk that require greater levels of collaboration and teaming than perhaps has been the case in the past. So let me leave it at that and stay on time.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. And now let's go to Martin Keller from Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
So my name is Martin Keller. I'm at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I'm the Associate Laboratory Director for Energy and Environmental Sciences. So I came to Oak Ridge about 7 years ago. Before this, I was 10 years in industry. Before this, I was in academia. So I know all the big three areas, which we'll come back to, which I classify as academia, industry, and national lab system. And I want to continue where Paul left it, that if you look back what we have seen this afternoon, if you see some of the research being done, I mean, if you just look at Lon Ingram's pilot plant, for example, what he built in Florida, what you see what we're doing in Oak Ridge, what you see in other different states here, the traditional way universities have done business will not cut this anymore. So it is too expensive, it is too complicated, goes beyond, they call it the traditional departmental structures. Research, the problems we are facing are multidisciplinary and perhaps also require a new model to tackle these huge problems. And this comes back what Paul just, how he described BESC. It's one of the models where you bring the strength of the different three major groups together. From industry, who is targeted, they know what they need to do to, at the end, make money. From the academia, where you have the flexibility, the creativity of the students. And perhaps from the national lab system, where you have some of the consistency, the experience in managing and coordinating large-scale projects. So if we bring the three together, you're suddenly having a team which can tackle some of these big problems we have to tackle. So BESC is one. Within Oak Ridge, we use this concept now to use the same idea on other projects. So for example, we also have one of these hubs, what you might have heard, what the Department of Energy initiated a couple of years ago, So the hub around the modeling of nuclear power plants is built in exactly the same concept. We're part of a winning team in the critical material hub, which Ames is leading. It's the same concept. We internally have done this in the building technology, in the vehicle technology. So I personally feel that this could be a model for the future to tackle some of these large problems. So I'm not saying that the more traditional academic research in the universities will go away. That's not what I'm proposing, because we also need this. We also need this departments and groups and this new, very specialized research. We absolutely need to continue this. But to tackle some of the large problems, I would say that we need new ways of forming these partnerships. With all the problems what Paul described, so it's not easy. But I feel very strongly that this is something what we need in the future to overcome some of our major problems.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move to you next there. Mr. Kenneth Chacey from Amoresco.
Thanks, Jason. My name is Ken Chacey. I'm from Amoresco, and I represent the, I guess, the industry part. And I think the reason why Jason wanted me part of this panel is it's a application of the R&D and all the hard work that you guys and gals have been working on, and a real live project that was put together, formulated over several years, developed a unique contracting mechanism to put in place, and then constructed over a 2-year period. And we just completed our first 2 years of operation. It's the biomass cogeneration facility at Savannah River site that provides 100% of the steam for critical mission operations there, and about 30% of the site's energy needs through renewable energy. It's the only DOE site that can make that claim. So it's a big deal, and a big deal for DOE to be able to process that program in a way that supported getting this online when it did. It replaced just to give you a little bit of background, it replaced a D-area powerhouse coal-fired facility, and the savings from that, from an environmental standpoint, were about 100,000 tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions, 3,200 tons per year of nitrous oxide, 2,300 tons per year of sulfur dioxide, and about 400 tons per year of particulates. So it was a huge benefit to not only the Savannah River site, but also to the state of South Carolina. We got tremendous support from the state in doing the licensing and support of this, but even with that great support, it still took a long time to go through that process. And we generated over the last year about 97,000 megawatts of power for the site. It's about $6 million worth of electricity and about 1.7 billion pounds of steam. And the reason why this is important because it brings closure to those skeptics out there that say that this won't work. It's too expensive. And I think this is a good live example of where it does and where it did and where it continues to. There were some challenges. I mean, there's no question that, for example, getting this unique contract mechanism in place called an energy savings performance contract, which DOE uses for these types of projects, was a challenge. The Secretary of Energy had to raise the level. Secretary Chu raised the level of the contracting so that we could do that. And the neat thing about it is that it's all privatized funding. It's not a federally funded project. We don't have to worry about CRs and continuing resolutions and all the challenges that the federally funded projects are going through today. And that works not only on the DOE side of the house, but also on the DOD side of the house. And I think the other unique aspects of the way this was set up was a partnership, if you will, with headquarters and the field offices to put this in place using different standards that is typically applied to a nuclear facility, for example. That may sound like an easy thing to work out, but it was a huge challenge and a huge effort through that partnership that made that happen. And I would assume that there'll be similar challenges like that if you do any kind of the things that you're talking about, especially first-of-a-kind technology, at any of the DOE sites or federal sites, and probably working with the states as well. The other challenge was trying to get the financing associated with the project in place. There has to be some way to translate all the different things that you guys talk about in language that only you guys understand, and get that in a way that a financial institution can understand and develop an understanding of what the risk is associated with funding a project like this. Any type of renewable project, I mean, ours is a 19-year contract at Savannah site. I mean, who can tell what the price of wood's going to be 19 years from now? So it was a huge effort to try to convince the financial institutions that there was stability to this program. And then, of course, there's other things like the standards, whether or not you're talking about the fuel standard or the standard that relates to the portfolio. Do you do that on a national basis? Do you do that on a statewide basis? I know on the fuel standard, for example, North Carolina has one, other states don't. And that's something that I think needs to be looked at because there really does need to be some stability to allow marketing, if you will, and actual construction of the things that you guys are talking about. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much there, Ken. And Laurel Harmon from LanzaTech.
So I feel a little bit like an odd duck here. We're also, I represent a company, so we're out in the industry sector. Our technology and the company was founded to utilize all kinds of waste carbon resources, and in particular, waste industrial gases as our first resource for creating fuels and chemicals. So our core technology is actually a biochemical process that consumes carbon monoxide containing gases or carbon dioxide containing gases, and through the metabolism of our organisms produces fuels and chemicals. Our development is actually proceeding primarily outside of the US, although our headquarters is outside of Chicago. However, I'm very happy to say that at the very beginning of 2011, we acquired the Freedom Pines biorefinery in Soperton, Georgia. And that is, in fact, a biomass-based process in which biomass is gasified to syngas, which itself contains carbon monoxide and is therefore a feedstock for our process. So we're very busily developing that site today. For us, there are more dimensions of partnership maybe than have been brought up already. We do have research partnerships throughout the world, in Europe, in Asia, here in the US. But in addition to that, we have development partnerships, joint development agreements with our customers, and our customers can either be those parties that have gases that they need to utilize, monetize, and also solve their pollution problems, or downstream customers who are interested in the products that we make. And so we have very tight relationships on either end of that to make sure that the processes that we're developing either produce the downstream chemicals or fuels that are of interest or are properly integrated. To put this in context, right now we've just completed operating a demonstration plant in a joint venture with Baosh Steel in China, one of the largest steel manufacturers in China. And what we're talking about is a gas fermentation biological process that's sitting right at a steel mill. It's tightly integrated with the off gases from one of the particular steelmaking processes. So the level of partnership and interaction that's required to do that is very different than a plant in which all you do is source your feed supply. And that actually we are starting the commercial plant also in China. We have plants going up in India and collaborations in Europe, and then of course the biorefinery here. We do work a lot with academic partners to address core technical, very fundamental questions, because synthetic biology is a very important part of our ability to expand our portfolio based on our proprietary organisms. And we work with national labs here in the US in particular. We've been very lucky, fortunate to have Department of Energy funding, for example, for a collaboration with both the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and the Pacific Northwest Laboratory to look at taking biomass through gasification, through our gas fermentation process, and then actually converting the products of our fermentation into jet fuel and to butadiene, which is a very important commodity chemical. So that, for us, would be an example of how government can partner with industry, with national labs. We have academic partners in that as well, to really move an entire value chain forward that no individual sector could handle alone.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah Laurel. And now let's move on to our last panelist here, Dr. David Hess from Vanderbilt University.
I am the Associate Director of the Institute for Energy and Environment, and then I direct a program in environmental and sustainability studies, and I'm a sociologist too. I'm in the sociology department. I have a bit of a cold, so bear with me. My voice is probably going to quiver a little. I want to build on the theme of partnership that I think everybody was raising today. And a project that I did in 2010 with 8 graduate students led to a long policy report looking at green technology, clean tech industries, and the role of state and city governments in this. So the partnership side of it that I was most interested in was the state and city governments. I looked at biofuels, renewable electricity, green buildings, smart meters, and battery and energy storage industries. And the question I was asking was, why are some states moving ahead and looking fairly successful in building these industries, whereas others are just sort of out of the game? And there are 2 levels to how we approach that. One of them is policy. And by looking at what's going on in a comparative perspective in many different state and city governments, we put together the suite of demand and supply policies that seem to be leading to successful industrial development. So on the demand side, if you look at, say, electricity and renewable fuels, it's net metering, filling stations for infrastructure, standards like a renewable portfolio standard, energy efficiency standard, fuel efficiency standard, system benefits charges. If you're in the Northeast or California, you have a greenhouse gas trading plan which generates revenue. You have government procurement policies, green fleets policies, early and sophisticated demand spurred by credits, PACE laws, and that kind of thing. And then on the supply side, you can't just have the demand policies, or other cities and states will come in and they'll solve your demand needs with products that are produced in their regions. So you have to somehow get your in-state industries working, and that can involve in-state production preferences for, say, manufacturing or local biofuels production, getting the state government into the venture capital role, jobs training, conversion of related industries, business development funds, green tech parks and corridors, tech transfer programs, standards, testing facilities, university consortia, and really getting the state governments, if this isn't being driven by the national labs, getting the state governments to connect the national labs with the local industries and the universities. And a model of this is New York BEST, the Battery and Energy Storage Consortia, which it's been a state government-driven effort to actually connect Brookhaven and the universities and the industries and the testing facilities and get people talking to lead to an innovation cluster. So I think that some states are leaders in certain industries, and we can look at this set of policies as one of the reasons why. But then I was driven, and I'm going to end right here, by looking at the political process too that's also involved in determining which states are out ahead and which ones are not. So I've been increasingly studying the politics of green energy, looking at, for example, state laws and whether Republican legislators will support certain kinds of laws but not others, such as PACE laws, before those were taken off the table for residential mortgages, versus increases of renewable portfolio standards. So I've been trying to get into the conditions that might lead to bipartisanship, and what we're doing is building up a very large database of state government votes by Republicans and Democrats to figure out if there are still areas where you can get bipartisanship on these policies. I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for all of that. And what I think has been pretty interesting here, I mean, David, with the state level policies, there's been a lot of focus, I think with the federal policies. And in the slides that I had, I was going to show just the RFS. And so we've all been talking about the RFS2 and from the Energy Independence and Security Act and biomass, bioenergy, that if you go back to the original act, that there was, for each year, we're supposed to be ramping up the cellulosic biofuels. And we've talked a lot about cellulosic biofuels at this conference. And then if you go to here, if you go to what the EPA is actually, what they've actually revised the standards down to, the line, you can barely see it. So each year we haven't met that. And then even, I'll just be more provocative, that if we go back what the EPA has said that we're supposed to produce, but then it becomes a question mark as to what has actually been produced. And so we've talked about there's the risks here, the policy risks. And I was born in 1975, but when I got interested in looking at bioenergy, then you see there's a lot of research very clearly in the late 70s. And that's where some of the seminal work came. And then, of course, we've talked about that about 1980, 1981, it just kind of drops away. And so we've gone through this before where there's a lot of hope, then something happens, and there is this feeling that we're on this precipice again, perhaps, with things like fracking. You just have to watch the news and see that we've had a lot of energy go into things, and then so someone can see a graph like this, and then the idea would be, well, we failed, that this has been a failure, and then but we learn, and of course Congress acts in the way they act, and so the challenge I want to give back to everyone here is that how can we take what we've learned and the energy that we have going, and how can we spin this, or I don't want to say spin, but how can this be a positive sort of learning thing, and how can we, what are the policies that we can move forward with? And I think David's really started off with the state level, and then how states may be involved, and then how can the national laboratories and others that I know the RFS too. I mean, talking with policymakers, that's on the chopping block in some extent. That you can see, like you can already hear the conversations that are going on at the national level, whether or not that's a good, if that's a good idea, if that's a bad idea, that can be for all of us to talk about. But it's happening, and so I just want to introduce all that out there for you guys to kind of chew on. And anyone can start.
So yeah, let me follow up on this one, because you bring up a point which is very worrisome in my opinion. You mentioned that well, let's say we would have had this panel 5 years ago. I would stay here and would say I'm absolutely convinced that we will implement the lignocellulosic biofuels. We're on a good trajectory. So now, 5 years ahead, what I would say is I'm still absolutely convinced we will have the technology. We will have it. There, I have no problem. I'm getting very worried if we will ever implement this in the US. If you talk, and this is now my other hat from within my job at Oak Ridge, we are in connection with a lot of oil and gas companies, fracking technologies. So certainly, you probably have all seen this in the media. The prediction is that we will export oil. So we have so much gas that we don't even know what to do with it anymore. All our reservoirs are more than full. They just drill to not losing the rights and cap it. So suddenly you see a huge wave of using natural gas. I mean, there's a big lobbying activity that you're using compressed natural gas for big trucks. They're building out this network of liquefied gas as transportation fuel for trucking industry. So my worry is that we going exactly back what you described, what we've seen in the 70s. We lost suddenly one of the big drivers in the last, let's say, 10 years, 5 years specifically, which was national security. Suddenly we have all this energy in front of our doors. And so the push from politics to get renewables, regrowable like biofuels, which was not driven by climate change, it was driven by national security. So now this is falling off the table. So now the question is, if you then take into the discussion that climate change, or how I like to phrase it when I go to Washington, so to certain groups, you're not talking about climate change, you're talking about changing of the environment. So if you're then taking this equation out, that you feel that burning fossil fuel will not contribute to our change in the environment, so then the question will be, why should we do that? And this is why this curve, I'm very concerned that we will not reach that.
So maybe with the state levels and economic development, because I always call it the trifecta when you look at the Energy Independence and Security Act, that there was the idea of climate change, there was the idea of course, energy independence and security. So of course, security is right there in the Act's name. But there's also this rural development idea that we need for wealth to go across the landscape, and so that's something I know at the state level in Georgia that's been. And that was the driver. Then is that still something? Is that a narrative that works? And then what are the policies that I guess states would need? We've talked about and things like portfolio standards and what are the models for the Southeast? And then what are the successes that I guess other states should be going to and saying this is what we can really follow? And so drop that out there for anyone.
So we don't, of course, have as much experience in the U.S. as we do in other areas. Something like rural development can certainly be a driver. It can be, policies around rural development can make it easier for developers to put a project together. But fundamentally, if technology doesn't produce a product that is competitive on a price point with whatever it's displacing, then none of the other factors really matter. A driver that, if you look at sectors like aviation, which is not huge relative to ground transport, but which is still a huge market, there's a dependence on hydrocarbon fuels that is not going to be supplied by natural gas. We have customers in the chemical space whose interest is not really in the renewable or low carbon dimension of the products, but they're interested in new sources of supply for C4 chemicals. And therefore, there are drivers that are independent of the factors that you've brought up that really pushed much of the early biofuels development and had up through recent times.
Other thoughts from the panel here?
I just come back to a point from that I made while I was talking about trying to get the finances for some of these programs and projects. This is the kind of thing that just drives the financial organizations nuts. The points that you were making make it very difficult for, bringing the technology that's been so hard, to develop and worked on for years into fruition because of this. And there has to be some way to stabilize that. And, I don't know if you do that at the state level. I think it's awful hard to push those things from the state level up. I think that's where, places like DOE really needs to take a strong stand in working with the other federal agencies and the states and local governments to try to push some of these things so that they know that they're not totally out on the limb in actually implementation of these programs, because they do represent a risk, huge risk for industry in that regard.
Let me ask a question of you, Lauren. In the electricity field, this discussion around price competition is centered on grid parity. And so, there's this prediction that it's going to occur very rapidly in solar. And then from the financial point of view, it's allowing companies to make investments because they can lock in prices over the long term, and they're predicting increases in grid-based pricing. Is there anything like this, a grid parity moment that you see for biofuels?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by a grid parity moment.
Well, grid parity would be the equivalent to gasoline prices or diesel prices,
So,
where it's breaking below it, so it's actually cheaper at that point.
right, so those are the benchmarks.
Right.
That is, for aviation, diesel, gasoline. Can you produce an energy equivalent fuel or identical fungible fuel at or below the same price? And if you're asking, do I see that coming? We do.
Is it something that's coming with the same level of rigor or predictability that we're seeing with, say, solar and wind, where people can say in X years we are predicting grid parity, and then that triggers the investment? Or is biofuels a little shakier? So you're not. Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah. So as an industry, I think it is more fragile. I think that it's a very diverse. Biofuels is not one thing, right?
Sure.
So we're talking technologically diverse, diverse in terms of required infrastructure, et cetera. So I think it is would be harder to predict across the industry.
So, because we talk about policy, I think one of the big missing links what we have is a long-term energy policy. Because so hypothetically, so now not that it's real, we have all this natural gas, we have all this oil. So now if you look at some of these companies, the prediction is that we're about 6 to 7 years ahead. Fracking technology will be used in other countries. They also will have, there's not a reason, we're not the only country in the world who has this type of resources by using this new technology. So the prediction is that other countries also will find a lot of extra resources. So how do we deal with this? We could fall back on what we've done in the 70s. I mean, as soon as the first oil crisis was over and we all bought bigger cars again, and this was all forgotten till the next crisis was hitting. So now I think from history, you can absolutely predict that we will have the same crisis in 25, perhaps 30 years. So how do we use this time? Because if we would have a long-term energy policy, perhaps we could use some of the energy and find a way that we take some of these tremendous resources and develop on a long time frame what we can do if this gas is gone. That's a problem that Washington is not thinking this way, because as you know, Washington works in this 2 or 4 years or maximum 6 years cycles. So this is one of the big problems. If we would have a long-term energy policy implemented, we would then work towards this goal, and then suddenly you could have this in the renewables, in biofuels, and you have a plan, and then you're slowly implementing this. Then I think we could use now all this natural gas to transition us over to a more renewable energy policy. My fear is that this will not happen.
I would agree wholeheartedly with the need for long-term stable policy. I would also argue that particularly because we want long-term stable policy, we need to articulate our policies in a somewhat different way. Policies that are performance-based, policies that are technology neutral. We today would not have predicted technologies that are coming to fruition right now 5 years ago. And I guarantee that we could not predict what will be emerging 5 years from now. And to the extent, and it's a difficult challenge, but to the extent that policies can be written in a way that they embrace new technologies as they emerge, we can get stability on that side too. I think you brought up initially energy security, climate change. I think we are, as a nation, having trouble today articulating what we're trying to achieve with our energy policy. And that makes it difficult to have a coherent plan.
So, but the frustration is that if you all look into your pockets, you probably have let's say you have an iPhone. So it will be very soon that we're taking our energy, we will export it to China, that they're producing the iPhones, which we then import. So is this what we as a country, is this the way to do this? Of course, we're seeing this on a global scale, and we have this. But on the other hand, I think we also, and this comes back why we actually started this discussion, that partnerships, large problems have to be solved in teams. And so now if you go this long-term energy policy and you put the climate change aspect on top of this, then it's getting very complicated and very messy. So there is a very interesting report done in Europe, of course, where Europe makes this, especially in Germany, they're going this, trying to be green, they're going all to this, no herbicides, no pesticides, doing all this farming. So if you then look that their productivity goes down, somebody in the world needs to catch up. So how do we play this on a world political area? So I mean, of course, if Germany, for example, is all nice and healthy, but then Africa needs to grow more food to compensate for the loss in productivity. So some of the people now even in Germany say, well, what about if we go full scale? We already ruined our landscape. So now use this and produce as much as we can on a global scale would make sense. And then you protect some other areas which are really good at carbon sinks. But we don't even know on our national basis to think in this way. And then if you bring this to the international basis, it's even worse.
I think we've undergone a fossilization of policy too in the last 2 to 3 years, so that when we look at the entering class of senators and members of Congress representatives, it's something like 90 out of 100 in the 2010 class signed an anti-climate change pledge. When we go through the state government votes, the single greatest predictor of a no vote of a Republican Party member is the fossil fuel employment in this state. Now, the way I look at this then as a political process is it's really important to build up another constituency. And when President Obama talked about 5 million green jobs, that is it is potentially a sea shift in political values among voters. And I think you can see this if you start studying the ratio of fossil fuel jobs to clean energy jobs. In some of the states, the clean energy, put it the other way, the clean energy jobs to fossil fuel jobs, not counting filling stations, because we could say that those are maybe someday biofuels jobs. It's 7 to 1 in Oregon. If you go to Wyoming, it's something like 0.2 or 0.3. So you can see that there's this dramatic difference within the country, and some states have actually made a transition where these two political forces are hitting a tipping point where the green energy employment and industries are starting to predominate over the fossil fuel. Now that could change if California goes into fracking and the employment shoots up in that area in California. Likewise in New York, where there's debate on about fracking outside the New York City watershed area. So this is a very volatile and dynamic situation, but I think the fact that we do not have a long-term energy policy the way that Europe does have one, I think is very closely related to this mobilization by the fossil fuel industry. So we're dealing with very fundamental political economy issues.
Let me add one word to that real quick. I started to say this before and didn't, but I am now going to say it. you know, the energy policy is certainly critical, but let me just add one word to that. It needs to be a national, across-the-board policy that looks at all forms of energy. And so whether or not small modular reactors are part of that mix, for some people that don't like that at all, and some political groups that don't like that at all, I think a comprehensive policy, the word comprehensive is critical, because it seems to get the people that support one thing on one side of the aisle kind of to the center, and the people on the other side that support this thing to the center. And so stressing the word comprehensive, I think, is critical for policymakers now, especially in today's environment where things seem to be very fragmented, in order to move the process forward. And in those technologies, you know, I totally agree with the fact that in order for something, you know, the bottom line is, you know, looking at it from an industry perspective, the bottom line is if the numbers don't crunch, you're not going to make it. You're not going to build it. You're not going to make it happen. So all the work that you guys do out there, it isn't going to see real life. If it doesn't financially make sense to do that. Under the same token, though, there are things that need to be incentivized a little bit in order to support the R&D that's necessary to bring them through that magic line into where they can actually work. And the point that was made here by several of the people here, that what we thought 5 years ago is not what we were thinking today. And it's hard to predict that, but there needs to be some way to work in that comprehensive energy policy, some way to incentivize things so that outside industry is willing to take the risk to go try what's being sought after and what actually may make a difference for this country in the long run.
You want to get in there, Paul?
Yeah, I think there are some very strong positive signs out there that we should be careful not to ignore. And let's take the message that's been common here, that is, if 5 years ago we wouldn't have predicted where we are today. 5 years ago, if we look forward to today, by now we should have had over the order of somewhere between 10 and 20 production cellulosic plants operating in full scale in this country. Now, what got in the way was this small little but non-trivial blip called a recession. And that slowed things down. But meanwhile, the technology push has continued in that period of time. Go back to that 5-year point 5 years ago and look forward. The industry or the enterprise at that time was characterized very much by, if you remember your movie The Matrix, it was a search for the one, right? It was the one feedstock, it was the one magic biochemical approach for essentially the one end product, which mostly was, at the time, was ethanol. Now, 5 years on, we're talking about a multiplicity or a diversity of feedstocks, perhaps even systems that are feedstock agnostic in terms of how they operate. More to the point, we're also now talking about more products coming out of a plant than simply the biofuel that we started looking for. Witness many of the discussions and some of the talks that were today on the example of carbon fiber as a potential product now from lignin, which up until now was a waste product of biofuel production. That's going to change the field entirely. It's going to make the production of biofuel perhaps itself be a byproduct of the production of another major product that is perhaps more revenue positive than even the biofuel. We could not have seen that 5 years ago. And policies wouldn't have led to it. Policies wouldn't have elicited that. And finally, again, at the risk of sounding overly optimistic, the reality is that despite that slowdown in the appearance of plants, of production plants, and particularly now for cellulosic, it is happening. There's at least one plant now operating in Europe that's in full production. We see plans on the drawing board or ground already having been broken. Yes, we're behind, but it's happening. So industry is voting with its feet to make this happen. So yes, it's dodgy and the balloon could burst, but I think there are very, very strong positive signs out there that there is a level of momentum that this industry is showing signs of taking off.
Very good. And I think you wanted to get in there too, Laurel, as well?
I remember what I was thinking at the time. You did trigger another thought, though, in terms of policy, and it is related to the idea of being comprehensive, that if we think in terms of carbon utilization and substitution for traditional sources like petroleum or ultimately natural gas as well, there are applications in which carbon itself is essential. Hydrocarbon fuels, guess what? They require carbon. The entire petrochemical value chain requires carbon. And so to the extent that policies can be crafted in such a way that they sort of drive carbon utilization into those sectors, I think that would benefit us in the long run. Your comment about co-products is another, I think a change that we're seeing is not just new co-products, but also that within the industry, there's increasing focus on co-products that are commodities and that will scale appropriately with biofuel production. Some of the early focus on biochemicals as a revenue generation source focused on niche applications, very high value chemicals, which were great for revenue, but which had very limited market. So they wouldn't scale to bring along a fuel industry. But a number of companies today are really trying to focus on very large volume chemicals that would substitute for important intermediates in the petrochemical value chain, and therefore can change the dynamics of the industry dramatically.
Can I just add to your point, because I fully agree with you, comprehensive is the way to go, especially small modular reactor and others. So then the other comments you made about, and Paul, by the way, I agree with you. I mean, if we don't think that we have the technology, we all wouldn't sit in this room and then do research. So I think it will come. So, but coming back to the point of our cost, because the very interesting point is, so hypothetically, what is if in a couple of years you could know for sure that emitting carbon will contribute to the severe change in weather. So let's make the same argument, like suddenly you could prove that smoking causes or having a higher risk of certain types of cancer. So suddenly if you could prove this, we are now or would play in a completely new ballgame, because who would then pay for all the costs by some of this severe change in weather? Suddenly if this cost would go back to the fossil fuel, then you would completely change the balance of price. And then, so how much do we talk? Is it $10 a ton? Is it $100 a ton? Is it $200 a ton? So suddenly the whole discussion, the price, of course, is the driver, but based on what baseline? And at the moment where you cannot make the connection of, to prove it 100% that burning fossil fuel will cause severe changes in weather and environmental climate changes. But as soon as we could really for sure nail this down, I think we would have a different discussion, also in Washington.
When you first said pay the price, I thought you meant it in a different sense, which is when you absolutely prove that connection, there suddenly become a lot of interested parties who will pay the price of the consequences, not in a taxation or carbon pricing sense, but insurance agencies,
lawsuits,
losses, dislocations. Good point.
And so that was one of the prompts that I actually had on here, and then we're kind of getting close to there, but as part of a comprehensive, we're talking about just an energy policy. And I'm not trained as an economist, I'm actually trained as an ecologist, but over time I've kicked kind of dragging and screaming that yes, price. And so what drives behavior within our complex economy is basically price, and so carbon taxes, and the idea of that should we have that conversation that I guess in this country, I just was from the Danish ambassador that was here yesterday, and she was talking about how expensive it is to buy gasoline there, and then so that changes behavior, and and so I know just pretty much any economist I talk to says that if you really want to have the most efficient way to change the energy structure within this country, that you really need to put a price on those fuels. And so I want to introduce that out there. I know we only have, I don't know, 25 minutes, and carbon taxes could, well, that could take up a whole hour and a half or even more. But I guess, or cap and trade, or just what would those policies mean? And are these things that for the next 4 years, you know, that is this something that should be pushed at the national level? And yeah, so you guys can advocate as you will.
Give you my personal opinion. I'm not a big fan of taxes, like almost nobody is. So, however, on the other side is somehow you need to have a fair price to the energy form we're using. And so suddenly, I don't know if this would be a tax, or I don't know how, I'm not an economist. But again, this is the key is, if you're linking, and hypothetically we see that climate change and fossil fuel is linked together, then the question is, are we then really costing our energy correct? And there I think there will be a huge gap opening, which then suddenly makes some of these other energy forms so much more interesting. So, but I think the key, in my opinion, to solve this, and that's the reason that we at Oak Ridge also initiated from a research portfolio a big program around manufacturing and help the training workforce, and also help to get manufacturing back into this country. Because I think for me, this is the solution to this problem. If we can get manufacturing back, and when you see that we're seeing a flow back of manufacturing jobs in the United States right now, a lot of economists told me that the reason behind this is our cheap energy. So I can see that. So again, what I said earlier, we suddenly have an interesting window for the next 25 to 30 years. As soon as we get our people back into manufacturing jobs, and then have the policy to link this with a long-term energy policy, bring the two together, and you overlay the potential threat through climate change, then I think the problem of price will automatically solve itself. And I don't know if this will be taxes or not, but the reason is we in the US are having extremely cheap energy costs. And if you go into Europe, it's a very different ballgame. So, and as soon as we have, based on all the changes, a fair price on our energy carrier, we will see a lot of changes.
We should also not forget, when we talk about job creation, and in this country we tend to focus on production that takes place within this country, but there is a window of opportunity still for the US to be a driver of innovation and therefore an exporter of technology, which could produce even more economic opportunity here. So benefiting not only what you described, but also creating jobs through technology exports.
I think it may be valuable to distinguish between a normative perspective. In other words, I agree we need a national comprehensive energy policy like that of Europe, and then a descriptive and explanatory social science perspective on the political situation, which asks why we have a closed political opportunity structure at the federal government level. And then once you've posed that question, it opens up the door to think in more holistic ways about constituencies being built, political constituencies being built through, say, cellulosic biofuels or rooftop solarization and various other things. But I think it is, yes, we all agree we need a comprehensive energy policy, and, we have to have a price on carbon. And it really doesn't matter a whole lot. Politically, it may matter whether it's a tax and dividend or a cap and trade. Politically, with cap and trade, you get the finance industry on your side, and they have a lot of money. So, that may be a better way to go than a tax and dividend policy. But I think, thinking about this strategically as well, and then connecting that to the economic development has some value.
We are talking, we keep referring to Europe as having stable policy, but there's great furor right now about proposed changes in the policy and the impact that'll have on the industry.
And even with Europe, I mean, what's very interesting here is that within the Southeast, within the biomass, and we've had a lot of talk about like logistics and just the whole kind of supply chain. That we've got these giant wood pellet facilities that are coming up in the Southeast, and so showing that, and which is not surprising because we've been doing that for years with the pulp and paper, but with policies in Europe that are basically we're taking our wood pellets, we're putting them on ships, and they're going across, and whether or not that's stable or not becomes its own kind of interesting question. But is there something that we can learn from that, from the idea that we show that there is this that we have this capability, that we can amass a lot of energy within biomass, and what are the policies to where we can kind of direct that back? I mean, and that's the question I hear all the time. I do life cycle assessments, and so everyone asks that does this make any sense that within Europe, or that it's for Kyoto or for whatever that they're doing it for, but all this energy is going on ships across the ocean, and are there opportunities, I guess in the near term for us to try to capture that? Would it be through RPS, through the portfolio standards, and yeah, let me just go ahead and throw that back out of the panel too.
So, I want to throw this out because we're listening to all this, and I think we don't want that you all go back to your room depressed and said, "Oh God, what I'm doing," because of course sometimes it looks all very frustrating. But on the other hand, if you step out there for a second and look to the US. The reason I'm very optimistic is a couple of reasons. First of all, we are not land limited, so we have tremendous amount of land. We still are the world champions in growing stuff. Nobody's beating our numbers there. And then if you go and see to other countries, what makes us unique is that we are a very creative bunch. I mean, we know how to work as a team, which a lot of countries can't do. If you look at the students, how we are even in this room, what Paul described, I think we are still the leader in bringing teams together. And then I think what separates us from everybody else is that if we make our minds, we make it happen. I mean, if you look back, and we made a decision, we fly to the moon, and who was at the moon? It was us. So the key, and this comes back to policy, how do we get this across that we as a country make the decision we want to do that? Get behind this, and then if we would get behind these problems, I'm absolutely convinced that we would be the nation to solve this. So the question is, now from a political perspective, how do we get all behind the topic, and how do we get this big kind of trench dissolved in Washington, that politics actually starts working again, that we, no matter what side is, that we getting behind the topic and get it done. That's what it takes.
I have an optimistic but cynical response to that. I have a paper coming out in Global Environmental Change on countervailing industrial power. To take the case of AB 32, this is California's global warming law passed under Governor Schwarzenegger. There was a concerted attempt in 2010 to bring that law down with Proposition 23. And $15 million was spent on that, largely from 2 Texas fossil fuel companies and some Koch brothers donations. And then there was a grassroots mobilization to protect the law with environmentalists and some ethnic minority groups, and then they brought the labor unions in. But it really, I think it really, what mattered was that they were able to get the wealthy Silicon Valley venture capitalists to put money into that, and they put $30 million, so they outspent the out-of-state Texas oil companies by a ratio of 2 to 1. And when you go through the state propositions, I have another paper analyzing these. Generally, when you're outspent, you lose, especially in the environmental area. You can just sort of go through it and analyze it. But in this case, there was money coming in. And the finance industry, I think, this goes back to some of the things you've said, is now seeing opportunities here. They're pouring huge amounts of money, $1 billion a year, into third-party financing for solarization. I don't think that's quite happened yet with biofuels, but you're the experts on that and can tell us what's happening. I think it's probably in the cards in the next 5 to 10 years. But certainly with solar, it's coming in. And when you get a very powerful industry lining up against, you can't have the power coming from the renewable industries. They're too small at this point. But if you get the finance industry, which donates a lot to these campaigns, I think there is some hope. So that's sort of a cynical, optimistic view of how we might get change.
Those are the partnerships we need to form, right?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's
Big
really
players
actually
out there.
right. It's and it's the tech companies. Google has put $300 million into this. The home security companies have decided that they're going to diversify from home security into rooftop solarization. There's just a lot of money going into this because it's seen as a good economic investment. So it goes back to sort of what you're saying, Paul, about it has to and Ken, it has to work out as an economic proposition. But once it works out that way, you have to have a big industry that's behind you that can then start putting money into elections.
Very good. Well, we're right at the time here where I wanted to get questions from the audience. So I'm sure there must be many burning questions. Very good. And so I saw a hand up here. Yeah, we've got the ambassadors going around with microphones. Yeah, we can start right here.
Yeah, Jeff Rinkemeyer with Iberdrola Renewables. We're a wind farm owner and operator. Just a couple of experiences from the wind industry when you're talking about policy. I do a lot of work in Illinois. And the wind industry, basically a wind farm is located in rural areas. You're not going to locate in an urban area. Most of the rural areas, I don't know about down here, but in the Midwest, most rural areas are represented by Republicans. The local economic development argument works very well with them. As a matter of fact, even at the federal level, Adam Kinzinger won election, and he won on a Tea Party platform, but he also supported the PTC extension. And the reason he did was because of all the wind installed in this district. So just talking to these guys, you can get through to them. Always got to remember, PTC was written by a Republican, and it was signed into law by a Republican.
I think you're raising a very good point. Now, when you're talking about this, you have to look at the pre- and post-2010 policies because there's a sea change in 2010. But I just completed a study of state economic development plans and looked at whether they target industries and do they target green tech. And I thought it would break down that the Democrats would be the pro-green tech and the Republicans would not. And it's actually fairly evenly divided. So I think you're absolutely right that this is one way to build common ground. Another is on energy efficiency. There's a bipartisan group in Congress right now trying to get energy efficiency legislation in place. So what I'm very interested in is figuring out where these opportunities are for finding bipartisan, sort of a way through these partisan splits. So I think that's a really good point.
And there's another questioner up here.
Hi there, my name is Tyler Faby. I'm a finance major at the University of Georgia. My research at UGA is on the energy infrastructure at UGA. And three things that I've found is, one, we still burn coal. Two, our deferred maintenance costs are valued at $300 million. And three, our physical plant division is severely understaffed to maintain building specs. The other side of my research is finding funding for efficiency projects so that we can decrease our energy consumption and actually implement renewable energies at UGA. And I know for a fact that efficiency investments are fantastic investments, especially when compared to say, the cost of importing coal on a yearly basis. So how do I, as a student, and my peers, how do we pitch that business proposal to people like our president, Michael Adams, or the incoming president, Jerry Moorhead? How do we get them to mature in their decision-making behavior so that they see eye to eye on the business plane?
Martin, you may be able to speak to the costs, or Ken, I don't know.
So of course I cannot talk for Georgia, but I tell you how I personally, being part of management at Oak Ridge, would deal with this. I would urge you more than once to go and talk to me and make these cases, because I think it takes people like yourself and your peers and to initiate this discussion. And then the second thing what I would encourage you is do not get frustrated if you don't see a change in a year or two. But I think it's important that this is bubbling up, and the more it bubbles up on more of these different locations, the better it is, because then sooner or later I think there is a hope of change. And what you've heard, what you've built in Savannah River, we have a similar plant what we built on converting our coal plant over to wood to get the steam at Oak Ridge. So there is other universities who have done a similar project. So Georgia has a lot of woods around them, so there might be ways to do this. So I think the key message is do not give up, try to be persistent and bring this point across and knock at the doors.
Let me back up Martin's point. I think the University of Tennessee at Knoxville has just converted from coal to natural gas.
Yeah.
Somebody here may know about that. So you could look at some other universities, especially regional universities, that have made that conversion, and that may be really a good way to sort of sell the point.
Make your case.
Arouse the competitive spirit.
Yeah.
Mr. Chacey, do you have anything to say about that? How do I get Amoresco on my campus?
It's real easy. I've got my business card in my pocket, and I'll give it to you as soon as we're through.
There's some real good live examples out there, and part of the problem with convincing people to do new things, I don't care if it's biomass related or other policy related activities, is you got to convince the decision makers that this is the right thing to do. So you just, what they used to call me is, they called me persistent. You just got to keep going after them, bringing different people, different perspectives, and if nothing else, they'll appreciate that. But the bottom line is that's what it takes. I mean, I totally agree. I mean, if this stuff was real easy, it would be done. So you have to be persistent, and if you want ideas on how to bring industry into look to support some of that, I'll be more than happy to talk to you afterwards.
Got one over here.
Evening. I'd first like to thank the panel and the organizers for this very salient discussion. Stephen Wood from the University of Tennessee. And while I appreciate the focus on biomass for this whole conference and this discussion tonight, I'm wondering if you can comment on wind, solar, and microhydro in the region, and if necessary, direct that to how it can be integrated and brought into synergy in the supply chain and in the processing of biomass.
So, as you know, we having at Oak Ridge some of this project where you look across the whole S from a regional perspective, what energy carrier would you deploy in what areas? I think, I mean, if you compare us to Illinois or up in the north, I mean, we do not have so much wind. Of course, we could put some of the windmills on some of the ridges, but you know that one of our very senior political people doesn't like wind so much. But I think the beauty, if you look at a regional perspective, I think the Southeast has a lot of advantages in the biomass program because we have a lot of biomass in our area. And of course there's other, I mean, as you know in Tennessee we have the hydro, and then there is, so my sense is I think we should not go down this path to say we're trying to put all this, let's say wind, solar, and bio in all the different areas. Use it strategically where we always have the best. I mean, of course, it doesn't work to put biomass into Nevada, so of course, but you can do solar. So there is all these different areas. So I would say we have to step it up to a whole national way. And then, of course, then to do this, what we need is a grid which goes across all this, which is another next big issue we have to overcome. Because at the moment, doing this strategy, our grid system will not be able to deal with this.
Hi, my name is Kenneth Castle, and I'm also from the University of Tennessee. And it's interesting that it's a nice segue into my question about UT's steam plant. Like you said, the administration has announced that it will be converted from a coal-burning plant to a natural gas plant. And I don't know if this is me just being cynical, but almost simultaneously, they announced that we will be doing fracking on UT land as a research kind of thing, so I'm making that connection. But it's obviously a reduction in emissions going from coal to natural gas, but it's not as big of a step as if we had implemented a biomass steam plant. And so I guess a question for Mr. Chacey would be that when you implemented your biomass steam plant, was it economically cheaper than other options, or were there costs that you swallowed recognizing environmental benefits, or the benefits of being a national model for the Department of Energy?
Well, that's certainly a good question, and economics certainly did drive the project. Realizing that this first was talked about 5 years ago, when they realized that the existing facility wouldn't meet the new air emission standards without a lot of money invested in it. Plus it was totally oversized for what it was trying to do for the mission of the site today. Economics was a key factor. Natural gas was not at the prices that it is today back then, or they may have come up with a different option for Savannah River site. I do know this: we are looking at, for example, bringing some gas from a landfill over to run our backup boilers for the site, just as another extension of the project that we're working on right now. In terms of comparison between the cost that it takes to get biomass and make a pound of steam versus the cost for doing that using natural gas, I'm sure that today's prices would hinge you in the direction that you went. I don't know where that'll be 5 years from now. I don't know where that'll be 10 years from now. But as what was mentioned here, we are in the Bible Belt of biofuels. I mean, we get all the fuel that we need within a 50-mile radius, anywhere from 19 to actually less than that, anywhere from $15 to $22 a ton, and it's profitable in terms of what they've experienced for other operations here at Savannah River site. And then when you look at the other aspects of this program and this project, it was initially designed specifically for steam, and that's the critical need for the site. But they added the turbines on that, 20 megawatt turbines on that, as a byproduct of some additional thinking and expense, which is paying off right now for the site. So there are a lot of aspects that go into that in your financial portfolio. The ones that were developed several years ago aren't quite the same as today because it is a changing market. But yes, we looked at all those activities as they decided what way to go and what technology to use at Savannah River site.
Yeah, just make one comment there. So look, I see where you're coming from. So, I mean, ideally, of course, it would have been better perhaps to change it over directly to biomass. But going from coal to natural gas, I think, is already a good step. And then if you look at the other, what UT has done, I still think that within the biomass program, Tennessee, with the biomass initiatives and the pilot plant, is on the forefront of this whole area. And then to the fracking technology, I hope that more universities only get into this research, because I compare this. I don't know if you've ever been at one of the sites. I call this, the gold rush in Alaska. This is how it's done. I mean, everybody who make this sloppy comments, you get out of school, you rent a rig and you start drilling. And we need research to do it in a safe way, and then we learn how we do this, because I think we will not prevent it, it will come, but I think we have to have research to support this, that we can do it in a safe way. So I applaud, honestly, from my perspective, that UT gets into this space. It's important.
Was there another question back there, I thought? There's one right up here. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, there's one over here. Whoever's got the microphone right there, you can go ahead and, yeah, you can go ahead and.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to go way back to when Dr. Gilna was talking about the partnerships, and you mentioned a conversion from PI thinking to a partnership thinking. And I was wondering if you could maybe expand upon some of the roadblocks that you guys met and how you maybe transitioned over the 5-year period.
It's hard to pin any one or even sort of finite set of roadblocks, because this is when in a forgive me, traditional sort of research or academic environment, the survival unit is the principal investigator. That is the researcher with his or her team that has been grown up around grants. And the real transition here was for the thought process to make the project be the survival unit, not the individual components. Now that's at a fundamental level, that's not just a change in thinking, that's a culture change. And so that's not something that you know, there's no recipes out there for culture change for dummies. It really is a slow, thoughtful, and deliberate process, as I said earlier, about building the experience of working together and making decisions together. Hard decisions at times, tough decisions, in some cases decisions to, say, drop a project. You know, the hardest thing to do in strategic planning is deciding what not to do. And so really the experience of just folks in this project coming together and making such tough decisions, sometimes ones that were not necessarily to their individual benefit. You know, those were, if you like, roadblocks that we worked out how to overcome. But it's slow, gradual, maybe not the most efficient way of just building experience, building trust, building the muscle set to be able to work with each other and make decisions together.
I always compare this. I mean, if you have in a small group, the PI is always right. I mean, he or she makes the decision that this is where the group goes. So if you run a project like this, you have suddenly 15, 20 really top scientists, and with this, by definition, you have 15 or 20 different opinions in the room. So, and then suddenly one person is not right. It's a group who develops this, and this means it's a different culture set to implement this.
I have a question. So that culture change is taking place within the group.
Yes.
What's happening at the home institutions? Is the contributes, because in each individual university, it is individual accomplishment that's the basis for it.
So Al, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think you might be able to answer that. So,
thank you. I'm Alan Darville. I'm director of the CCRC at the University of Georgia, and I'm the PI of the Georgia component of BESC that Paul and Martin have been telling us about. And BESC at UGA is a component of 6 academic departments and a research center. And we have faculty in all those different departments that work together to achieve the goals of BESC. And over the 5.5 years we've been doing it, it's actually been quite remarkable how everyone's come together and just work as a team. It doesn't matter which department they're in or who gets credit for what. We just work together as a team to achieve the goals we set, not only at UGA, but within the whole BESC environment. So I think it's just the natural growth of everyone working towards a common goal, basically. And it was very exciting to be part of it, actually.
Okay, well, thank you, Al. And
may I just, sorry,
sure.
Jason.
Sure,
may I just
absolutely, Bob.
add to that? Paul is exactly right, that the academic reward structure is not built around teamwork. And it requires a cultural change. And I think the slowness of how this developed within BESC is sort of indicative of where we're coming from as academics, right? I mean, we got tenure because we did something that somebody recognized was due to our intellectual contribution, not part of a team. And so I see this country, this world going forward in changing that reward structure in academia. I think that's something we have to struggle with pretty soon. I haven't seen much of it happening yet, but these opportunities for this level of teamwork are going to drive that conversation. It has to happen.
All right, well, thank you so much, Bob. And we're just a little bit over here, so I'm going to try to end it here. I want you guys to please join me in thanking the panel up here. Wonderful, thank you all.